This conference will now be recorded.
And it is being recorded, so it will be online for folks who want to share it or see it later. So thank you. This is the Licensed Professional Planners Association of Nova Scotia, and in partnership with the Atlantic Planners Institute. And we're here today with Wayn Hamilton. And I'm going to hand it off to Wayn. He's talking about his experiences with anti-Black racism in Nova Scotia. And Wayn is with the Provincial African Nova Scotian Affairs Department. So Wayn, thank you for coming to us. This is a very topical conversation over the last couple months for sure. And we appreciate you being here. So off we hand to you.
Thank you. I want to try to locate this presentation and the work that we do here at African Nova Scotian Affairs, but also in the reality that I think is really striking, because I read again this morning your statement that you made, which is on of how do we pledge to work against racism and discrimination. So I first of all have to applaud the efforts of the association taking such a bold step. And it's really impactful when individuals come together and decide that, as they say, enough is enough, or what can we do? There's an African proverb that says, in order to undertake the learning, you have to come out of one's house. So I applaud your efforts to try to understand this ever fast moving topic, because it does change with regards to definitions and how people need to try to address things like racism and discrimination. So that's the context around what I want to try to lend my voice to, which is this journey of discovery. And this first slide helps to give you some context around thinking about here in Canada. And I put the slide up with this title because it takes me back when I tried my attempt at being a classroom teacher. And the school that I was at, it was an elementary school, and it was somewhat racially diverse. And I found that the kids really got along with each other very well. But every now and then something would happen, and it was something that usually translated from an event that happened on the playground that came into the classroom. And those were times for me to take that moment to say, this is a teachable opportunity. Let's see what I can gather and glean. And the reason why I say all the trees are not maple is one of my students came into class after break, and he had a certain kind of a sadness on his face. And I can tell that something happened on that playground that really wasn't just sitting right with him. So I asked him to stay behind after the kids went for the day, and asked him what happened, why was he troubled? And he said, they were making fun of me because they tell me I got slanty eyes, and they asked me if I can see like everybody else. And they were joking around, they were having fun, they were teasing him, but it didn't sit well with me, and obviously it didn't sit well with this student who was struggling to say that he had a difference because he was of Asian descent. And all of a sudden now he was no longer just one of their playmates, but he was a playmate that had this characteristic that defined who he was. So the next day in class, I started to talk about the number of trees that are in this country. And I asked the students to shout out the trees that are there. So you heard birch, oak, you heard people talk about fir trees, people talk about elm trees. And then I landed on, what about maple tree? Yes, Mr. Hamilton, there's lots of maple trees. And what's on the flag? A maple tree. Well, how come they put the maple tree on the flag? And there was a complete silence in the room because they were puzzled. And it was, they decided to put a flag with a maple leaf on it because they wanted to symbolize something that says about Canada. But that's not to say that the other trees are not important to growth in the forest, because there's all kinds of different trees. So folks got to realize that even though there's one, quote, maple leaf on the flag, this country is made up of lots of different trees. And I flipped from going to talk about trees to now talk about they themselves as individual students. And so I said, okay, when you look at me, what do you see? And this was hard for kids that are grade 4, but they got into the realm of what I wanted them to do. Well, you got a dark skin. Your hair is not straight like mine. Okay, and but what about you? Oh, this one has freckles. That one has brown eyes. That one has short hair. And by the end of time to go for recess, everybody understood that they have something to offer, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're just one size fits all, and all the trees are not maple. So the context about what I'm wanting to say is that we've got to try to break that mold that says there's only one type of a Canadian, or there's only one type of way that we need to understand the world, as opposed to there's multiplicities of how we understand the world. And the challenge and the beauty and the magic is to try to understand as many as you can. So what tends to happen in some of this conversation is that we get involved in looking at this larger word called diversity. And this little cartoon tries to capture that, sometimes that notion of all us being in the one big tent. So you have the order being put in for refreshments, and it goes from a Pepsi to a Coke to a 7-Up, a large coffee, a small coffee, green tea, iced tea, fuzzy navel. And why would we have all these different kinds of drinks? Well, they're for our diversity committee, because everybody has their own preference, and we want to make sure that we take care of everybody. This next slide, and I'm trying to lean into this gently before we rip the bandage off. This is a cartoon that talks about a relationship, again, coming around this notion of diversity. And there's a cute little dog with a tie on, and he says, every one of your employees is human. You have a rather narrow definition of diversity, don't you? And when you think about it in the realm of what we're using these words about, at some level we are trying to be inclusive, but sometimes we don't get inclusive because we always, in some way, shape, or form, will leave somebody out. That's just inevitable. But this next slide is really all about what tends to happen in some of the work that we do, is that people assume that everything is fair and even. And we know that that's not the case, because there are some individuals in this province and in this world that have certain kind of perks and privileges, not that they earn them, but they are bestowed upon them in some cases based on the color of their skin, how much money they have in their pocket. So all that to say that this topic and this journey that you're going on, you will have to understand that a lot of people talk about, quote, diversity, and there's all kinds of multiplicities around that word. And you really, really got to be paying attention to the definitions of what these words truly mean. What I'd like to try to talk about for a moment, though, is what I've come to know, and that is that the work environment does not have the same competencies for culture and racial inclusion. So those competencies that we all know about in terms of what skills we have and how we manifest them are great. But in the world of work and in the world that I see, we don't have those competencies for how to have the right size cultural relationships or the right size racial inclusion. And so we sometimes falter in these two regards because they are challenging to us. So I want to just take a moment to just preface what I'm talking about. So when we talk about culture or cultural things, it's not a book that tells you what culture you're going to go into, but rather there's a pattern of arrangements. There's behaviors that you've learned over time. There's a collection of things that tend to happen, and they go and are bestowed upon us from one generation to the other. And you can actually see those patterns of behavior because they're transmitted by the various symbols that make up who we are as people, and in some cases, who we are as a cultural group. But those sets of rules and norms, they're there to help promote this notion of stability and harmony within the societal grouping. You know, how large you make the word culture or how small you make the word culture, there are some rules that govern how you act accordingly. And those characteristics and that knowledge of a particular group, they really do tend to encompass the language, the religion, the kind of social habits, even the kind of music that you listen to, or what you think is art, or what you think is beauty. So those kinds of cultural patterns are within us. They're imprinted on our DNA. But likewise, there's this notion of race and racialization. And this particular word, as you know, is just a human construct. It's not based on any kind of scientific evidence, but it is what it is, and we have it now. So we've got to try to lean into it and understand where it becomes a challenge. And it becomes a challenge in lots of different ways where there's characteristics that stand out. And by virtue of those characteristics, people start to self-identify what they think is going on with that individual. And these categories that society places us in, they are bound by a certain kind of set of physical characteristics, like skin color or hair type, even eye shapes. And those kinds of identifiable markers tend to make sure that they're there for all to see and all to know. And they tend to stand out as the way that we try to interact with individuals, as opposed to seeing them as human beings first. So groups of people, they do believe to be biologically related, and so they tend to congregate. And members of the group that share this unique social and cultural heritage tend to cluster themselves around racialized groups. But if we think about the whole idea of being competent in our skills, I would argue that we don't have the same level of competency for understanding culture and understanding race. And so my definition about what I'm trying to move towards here in the work that I do in the office and also across government is to try to lift up those competencies. And those competencies refer to the skills, the attitudes required to develop and maintain a healthy cross-cultural, cross-racial relationship. And it forces us to notice and analyze those dynamics. It should confront us when we try to understand, are we being culturally sensitive or culturally insensitive? And you will know that depending on how you interact with people who are not like you, because of the fact that you're trying to understand, but at the same time, you're not making too many value-based judgments that are not based in fact, but they're based in observations that haven't been necessarily proven. And I want to end by saying that people aren't racially competent. It's something that's has to come about after lots of exposure and lots of experience. But after a while, it gets to the point where we understand what we need to do, be much more culturally and racially competent. And obviously, one of the first things that off the mark is the attitudes that need to change. And that the world is not only through the eyes of that is Eurocentric, that the world is multiplicities of ways of looking. And we've got to make sure that those attitudes are all encompassing of that. And when I read you guys' statement, you did talk about those kinds of things, certain kinds of things. You identified the Nova Scotian and the Mi'kmaq community, getting the dignity and not getting the respect that it deserves. And it's probably because no one knows or no one really thought about how do we respect those other cultures, because they're not like us. No reference points. Policies must change to become much more flexible and inclusive. And there's a slide later on that I would share with you, because that has been our calling card when we talk about changing government. And then finally, the practices, those everyday kinds of things that we do, they need to be much more congruent with the knowledge and the understandings about culture, especially of racialized groups. And the more that we practice the ways of learning and the ways of interacting, we get a bit more competent. We get a bit more confident in being able to have and enter into spaces that we hadn't been before, because we have a bit of a familiarity about it. So I want to pause for the moment and just talk a little bit about the fact that and people don't necessarily agree with this statement, but for me, I believe that we do live in a racialized society. And I think Canada tries to hold up a certain kind of understanding about different than the United States, that we were the home of the Underground Railroad. Well, guess what? We were also the home of slaves that were here in this province at Fort St. Louisburg. And we had slaves brought and sold at the Halifax waterfront. So we've got this dichotomy with to lift up and say that we didn't treat individuals the way that they had done down in the States. But I would argue that that's the story that needs to be told, because it has happened in this province and it has happened in this country. So I'm asking the question, and you can stew on this internally, or you can mull about it later on. But I would ask you the question, when was the last time that your racial identity came up in terms of a question? Maybe it was a comment, an observation, maybe in a conversation, maybe at work, at home, or even in a store. From where I sit, where I live, my everyday experiences don't take me too far away from wondering whether or not I'm going to have to be dealing with somebody who's identifying me based on the color of my skin. And the most obvious one is when people see me and they ask the question, where are you from? And when I say to folks, I'm from Beachville, they will go again and they'll say, no, but where are you from? And once again, I will say, I am from Beachville. By the third attempt, I know where they're coming from. They're asking me because they see me now as the other, as not belonging. And that question, where are you from? Even though Nova Scotians are friendly, we really do want to know where you're from, because we're of kith and kin. We really, really want to know those family relationships. But when it comes in a certain kind of a way, my spidey senses tell me that the person is identifying me as not being here from Nova Scotia. I am 8 generations removed from people that were enslaved. And to be here in Nova Scotia, I'm a proud Nova Scotian. So whenever somebody asks me that question once and they have to ask it to me a second time, it's a point in time that I have to decide, is that a teachable moment or do I let it go? Because I don't know how much more energy I got to save with the rest of my day to tackle somebody that says, can I see your ID? Or I go to the bank and the bank is questioning the amount of money that I want to either deposit or withdraw. And true story, that happened with me when I was working overseas, and I came back after 4 years, and I will say that my pocketbook was fat with cash. And when I came back, I wanted to make some purchases, not through a banking machine, but to have cash, because I have a very large family with lots of nieces and nephews. So I had this idea that I would want to make sure that I gave them a bit of spending money. And I went to a bank, it'll rename nameless for the moment, and I went up to the teller and I wrote out an amount on the check. The teller looks at me, looks down at the paper, looks back up to me, and her demeanor changed. And my first reaction was, because it's happened before, she thinks that that's not enough money for me to have in my bank account. So the people behind me, though, are thinking that I'm here to rob the bank. Why else would this person just be having a stunned look on their face based on the fact that they're reading a piece of paper, which is actually just a check? So the lady took what I wrote, which was a withdrawal slip, over to probably her bank manager. They both look at the piece of paper. They look at me, and then he comes over and he says, Mr. Hamilton, thank you for using our bank, but we're wondering if we could have another piece of ID. And at that moment, I realized that that amount of money that's on that piece of paper, he already made a judgment that a black man can't withdraw that amount of money and have that person to be not truthful, or that I may have stolen it, or some other kind of wild and fancy story that was going on in his brain. So at that moment, I have to make a decision. Do I give him this ID and satisfy the fact that I didn't steal this money, that it was mine? Or is that a teachable moment where I say with a louder voice, I hope you ask everybody for a piece of ID when they want to withdraw a large amount of money from this bank. So what I did, I showed him a piece of ID, then I showed him another piece of ID and another piece of ID, and I laid 4 pieces of ID on the counter, and I said to the gentleman, pick one. And oh, by the way, give me back that piece of paper. And I took all my money out of that bank, and I've not been in that bank since. Now, whether or not he was doing due diligence to make sure that he was protecting the bank's interests by checking on me, the way that he did it signaled that a black man can't draw $5,000 from a bank account. So stories that I could tell you would take up probably the rest of this hour, but I don't want that. I want to try to leave enough stuff that we can at least chat about. So when it comes to this notion of living in a racialized society, it does happen to those. And for people who are of European descent, you tend to, I guess it would be stay in the center and not see everything that's around you. Because if you're in the center of a circle, you're only able to see what's actually in front of you. But if you were able to step out on the margins and see the largeness of the circle, you may then see how other people are saying things that have been true, but they now start to ring true because actually you can see and understand it. I often wonder, why is this the moment that people who are white are trying to say, what can I do? What can I do to try to make things better? And yes, it was what happened down in the States with George Floyd, and for having on a camera the visceral reaction of a person putting their knee on somebody's neck. And that look on that officer's face was like, there's nothing anybody can do. But I'm reminded about the same moment in time that we had when Rodney King was beaten. And I urge you to go back and watch that video where the LA were beating this man senseless. And for the moment, the turning point, but it never. So I wonder, why is this moment different than that which had happened before? And maybe it's because we really are understanding that we're saying this, we've been saying for a long time, that things need to change. So I welcome more allies into this work, because it's going to take a lot of effort from everybody to be able to champion what we have to do almost in our daily lives, because we have to confront it. But I want to mention to you that a lot of the work that we do and a lot of things that you're going to say, that perception is driven by the context. Perception is context driven. In other words, we assume that what we see is actually the truth, or what we assume to see is something that we know is reality, when we don't actually check and find out where's that body of knowledge coming from. And when you look back at it, it's probably an experience that you had that was positive or negative. It may have been something that you read. It may have been something that you had been told. That helps to inform your brain when you start to get into understanding what we would consider to be the stereotypes of what we are assuming is in front of us. But oftentimes we get to the point of understanding that the world is ever changing, and we always have to be challenging our perception about what we think is going on. And I wonder, are we actually challenging those jokes? And those jokes, probably when we were all growing up, we heard them, and they were probably making people of color who probably weren't in the room, but it was a little bit of a snide remark, or it was a riddle. Where were we then? I wonder if we're trying to inquire, why are there no BIPOCs in our ranks? BIPOC is a combination of Black, Indigenous, people of color, to try to get that whole collectivity of people that are brown skinned. But why aren't we asking that question? Why aren't there more of those individuals in our ranks, either with your organization, and even here in government? Out of 10,000 employees in the provincial government system, there's only 2 individuals. No, sorry, I take that back. There are 5 individuals that hold the title of executive director. And it was only in 4 months ago that we had our first deputy minister who was a person of African descent. So out of 10,000 employees with the provincial government, there's been very little upward trends for people to be in decision-making processes. They're supposed to be in flatline with entry level and tend there to stay that's where you will be. I'm wondering if we are involving ourselves in this kind of a journey that may take into consideration attending a rally or a march, even writing letters, or even boycotting different organizations or different places that are not necessarily truly inclusive. And are we speaking out? And I had to put my rant around the sugar here because I need to also relate a bit of a story because it may be in your world as well. Atlantic Sugar have a number of products. And one of the products that they have is brown sugar. And about 8 years ago, they put out marketing for brown sugar packets, and they called it Plantation. And they had an image of a gentleman who was dark skinned with a bit of a straw hat tipped to the side, playing on a violin, very serene, very tranquil. And they were trying to convey this notion that the plantation sugar was all good, and that this person who was an older gentleman playing on the violin, it was an artistic representation, was nothing to be fearful about or nothing that should be considered outraged. When I saw that packet of sugar, my immediate reaction was they don't understand the word plantation and that that was a killing field. That out of Africa, people came from Africa just to work on sugar plantations. So I wrote a letter to Atlantic Sugar, and they got I got a polite letter back saying that that graphic design won awards. They never meant any harm by it, and that they were going to stand by their product, and that it wasn't any ill will in having that kind of a representation. So I decided instead of going after the big cheese, I went after whoever was sugar in their establishment. I wrote them the letter, and I can gladly send you the letter. And it has a one-pager, which is the background about this notion of sugar plantations and how cruel they were. And I can tell you that 5 hotels now have not taken up getting more orders from Atlantic Sugar for their brown sugar packets. They've taken the graphic image off. They'll have the language called plantation on the raw sugar, brown sugar packets. So to me, that's intolerable. I cannot allow that to continue without challenging the system that says it's okay for us to call it plantation sugar. It's not okay because it's offensive to me. Then there's going to be a whole lot of opportunities I think you guys are involved in where you will be challenged to try to read what this moment in time is. Maybe you'll attend some functions. Maybe you'll have people like me coming to talk, and I hope you have a variety of people talking because my views are not necessarily all the views of everybody who's Black in this province. We're just as diverse as the population, and we do not always agree with everything. But the whole idea is to try to get out of your comfort zone and go to those places that actually challenge your sets of assumptions and also your perceptions. But I'm hoping that you won't just get into what I call 3D, dinner, dance, and dress. Because if that's as far as you can take the notion of learning, then you're falling really short. And that would require really difficult conversations in going to places where it make you will feel uncomfortable. And that is talking about race, talking about privilege. And you may not be able to do that at home right now, or you may not be able to do that at work, but don't lose out on the opportunity whenever it may rise up. And I'm not saying that you jump in and all of a sudden say, hey, Black folk, let's have a conversation. I think that would be dangerous. I think it's trying to learn as much as you can and then try to find folks that will give you some space in order to ask the questions, knowing that you probably won't get it right for the first time, but you're actually trying to learn, but learn from a place that says, I can do better once I know what I've done wrong. But I want to wrap up and move on to some chatter by sharing with you what has been one of the foundational outcomes of the work that went into the inquiry for the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. For 4 years, myself and a few other folks that were on the commissioners on the commission to look at the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, recognized that what happened was a failure of the entire system, and that we neglected children. And if we think about children being human-centered and the need to protect them, that's what we did not do when it came to the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. All the various components of the government were trying to, in my opinion, protect the system of government versus the people that they are meant to serve. So the journey that we're on right now is to make sure that all the work that is moving forward has this notion of having a human-centered approach, which is not to say that we stay in that siloed and that fragmented pieces of doing work only for justice or doing work only for education, but rather you think about how you got to be horizontal in your thinking so that you have at the table the individuals that are from those departments, because no individual should be chopped up and only assume that they're only to go to community services for one element of what they need. Rather, they should be seen as a whole person. And that's what government has a problem trying to figure out, how to take that holistic approach. But there are ways to do it. And I'm not giving up my to make sure that we get it. And you're not be able to see the slide very clearly, but in government, it really is about this notion of who is having this notion of blame or liability, as opposed to let's try to focus on problem solving, put our focus there as opposed to the blame and the liability. And instead of the idea of having this to be an individual to an individual, let's look for relationships, because it's the relationships that become the way that we have to move forward. And that's the highest function that we can try to have, is establish relationships as opposed to things being seen as an individual contract arrangement between person A and person B. The hope is that for accountability to responsibility, that we will move away from that risk averse and actually try as hard as we can to try to figure out how to do no more harm. And oftentimes in government, there's always this defensive posture. And the hope is that we'll move away from that to a learning posture. And so that we don't necessarily become reactive, but we become proactive and try to be responsive and be proactive in the things that we try to do. In government, it's all about the compliance, as opposed to, can we be a bit more responsive to make sure that the regulations are speaking to what they should be, not protecting the system, but understanding what the human condition is. And then finally, we really do see the sense of moving towards transactional.
Wayn, sorry, Wayn, you're when you move away from the camera, we can't hear you as well.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
then I got to stay focused.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm going to wrap up because this is my second last slide. Yeah. So right now, here in the work we do at ANSA, we have found some allies in other government departments that are truly trying to understand how to make this radical shift. And our hope is that as we start to go out and work with community groups and look with organizations, we will try to have the opportunity to dive even in deeper to how we can have these kinds of things put forth a better society. And I want to end off before we get into some chatter with this last slide, which is every now and then I take a moment to try to reflect. And this one is all about, to reach others, we must first know ourselves. And to contact the deeper truth of who we are, we must engage in some activity or practice that questions what we assume to be true about ourselves. And so my hope is that people will take that self-reflection, because that's where the journey of discovery for how to be better human beings actually starts. So I'm going to put myself on some kind of a pause or mute. I'm sorry for having rushed through this presentation. Wanted to have a couple of touch points that allows for maybe something that people would want to a little bit deeper. And I promise I'll just stay close to this mic.
Perfect. Thank you, Wayne. So we appreciate you very much coming here. Thank you for having read our statement. I know a number of people on the call worked on that, and it went through many different iterations. And I guess my first thing is there anyone out there that has any questions or comments for Wayne, just to start the conversation? And if you would, what we usually do is just unmute your mic and I'll see the green and I'll call on you. So give everyone a chance to ask some questions or any comments to start. Okay, so Wayne, it's been a while since we chatted. I think I've met you maybe only once or twice, but we were working on Beachville together and we went with Carol Ann. And so this is the kind of questions that project started in me, Beachville being an African Nova Scotian community. But what I find interesting as a person that racially, and I guess, you know, identified would be white, straight, male, Christian, everything that you would say is privilege. I think what's interesting for me when I look at the term Eurocentric, I think it helps me understand a lot about how race is a construct, because if I was to look at my own ancestry, I would see Scottish and French. And interestingly enough, on the Scottish side especially, you can read stuff from the 1950s and 60s describing the Scottish race or the Highland race or the Gaelic race, whatever you want to call it, whatever description they used. And it strikes me as really so odd because now we're all just white, if you will. So in some ways, the race is just so flexible, you know, from one point of view, it's this group of people that came from the north of Scotland, but then all of a sudden when it's convenient, we're all just white. And to me, as I started kind of internalizing that, it really hit home for me about exactly how much that idea of white skin is a very, or dark skin or brown skin, whatever, is very much just created. And the idea of culture not necessarily flowing with your race. I guess I put it out there because to me it started to provide at least something where I could start to relate with the idea of race from a different perspective of just being white. Okay, well, what else is there? So I guess my question for you is, do you find that, how do you find that other people start to approach race that aren't necessarily BIPOC? Is it a tough conversation to get into? Still there, Wayne? Wayne, just checking you're here. I'm not hearing anyone out there, so I don't think you're on mute. Jay, are you here?
Yeah, it's not Jay, but it's Dylan. Hi.
Hello,
Hi.
Dylan. Do you see, I see that if I'm correct, Jay is under Pretty's account. It looks like he's still online. Is that the case?
Yeah, he still said is the presenter and still here, I guess.
Okay.
There's some message in the chat.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, great. So Wayne is still here, and I guess the floor is open for comments or questions. Oh, it's not picking up. Okay, I see. Yeah, we can't hear you, Wayne. Dylan, is Wayne muted?
It doesn't say that he's muted.
Okay. I'm going to turn my mic off and see if that helps. Wayne? Wayne, can you hear me? Can you wave if you can hear me, Wayne? Okay, so we have no sound. I don't know what to tell everyone here. Maybe. Is your, in the bottom right corner, is your mic somehow turned off on your computer? Thanks everyone for sticking around. I see a lot of people still here, so. Yeah, I think we might have to come back to this. Wayne, maybe what we can do is maybe, I think you said in the comments here that you wanted to comment on whiteness. Maybe what we'll do is maybe just send me a paragraph or two on that in written form, and I'll send it out to the group. And okay, so Wayne's got his thumbs up. We're making it up on the fly as we go. And I guess, yeah, Gordon is, are you seeing the comments here from Gordon, Wayne? Okay. Okay, so yeah, he's checking on some stuff. If anyone else has any questions, okay, we've checked on the mic. If anyone else has any questions or thoughts, Wayne can hear us, so if you want to let him know anything, that would be good. I'll get an email response on North America, blacks and whites, how they were together in the 1700s.
Yeah,
Sounds
that's what I wanted to talk about.
Oh, hey, you're back. We heard you just there. You want to try again?
Okay, very good. Oh,
We can hear you.
no, I want to take a moment real quick to talk about your mention about whiteness with this larger collectivity. Are you still there?
Yeah, we're still here. We can hear you.
Oh,
Awesome.
okay. Because when the United States was opening up the colony, they were allowing people to come over from Europe, especially from England, in order to become indentured servants. And there were various points in time where you had indentured servants that were trying to make a good go of it. And the wealthy landowners would give those indentured servants an opportunity to work off a plot of land, but would require them 8 to 10 years of hard labor, and after which time they would be given their own plots of land. At the same time, these indentured servants were on the same property as those that were enslaved. And how it goes, making sure that there was the opportunity to keep the masses down, they separated the whites who were indentured servants from those that had been enslaved, because they both felt that they were not getting the right kind of treatment from the wealthy landowner. So the wealthy landowners gave certain sets of privileges to the indentured servants, and that allowed there to be the beginning of this separation between blacks and white, who were all laborers, but they were all working for somebody who was way richer than them. And if you really want to take a peek at the story, it's what was called the Bacon Rebellion. And it was what the white wealthy class had decided to put down, which was an insurrection amongst the blacks and the whites, who were both at one point in time together on trying to overthrow someone who was treating them bad, even though they were there working for these wealthy landowners. It's a point in history where there was no such thing as, quote, color, in terms of it being all in the same boat, because they were all poor, or they were indentured, or they were enslaved. And so sometimes people have to understand that there's points and times in history where there wasn't this notion of a separation. But when we think about what happened with the indentured servants being allowed to then look after those that were enslaved, that turned into the slave patrols. And then the slave patrols turned into what people will talk about now, which is policing. And so there's a lot of connections to those things that have happened that we don't know about, that really set us up to the way that we see the future now. But I can send you some information about that, because it's a fascinating journey about how the two racial categories at one point in time were fused together based on wealth, and then how that got separated out when the more wealthy landowners want to make sure that the masses didn't rise up against them.
Interesting. Thank you. We're coming up to 2 o'clock, so I'll give a last call for any questions. And so if we don't have any questions, I am just going to mention a little bit for yourself, Wayn, because we'd love to have you back. Not sure when we might be able to do that, but also for everyone online here. So this is one of the bigger turnouts for our webinars, our lunch and learns. So that's a really great sign. And what we're doing right now, LPANs, there's a number of things, but in terms of professional development, having more talks like this is critical. And we're looking to different groups, to different individuals. And in this point, it's kind of in the organizational phase. It's like, when are they free? You know, so we hope to have more of this. And we hope to see a lot of different voices. And I think one thing that, as the person planning a lot of these events or helping to plan these, is important that you mentioned is talk to lots of different people in the community, because there's tons of different viewpoints and diversity. And we'll try to keep that in mind, because as we get deeper into this, we'll start talking more about racism in land use planning, among other things. We need to keep in mind that we don't just need planners in the room to do that. We need lots of different people with different viewpoints in the community, because everything interacts, as you were saying. There's so many different parts of a government or society. If you just do them in one little slice, you'll miss so much. So
yeah, and you guys are so critical to how the future should be shaped differently, that you got to keep going on this journey. You do, because you're so interconnected to all the communities for what you bring to the table. So don't feel like you're not an important player in this. You guys really, you are.
I think that's good to hear, because it is, at least from my point of view, sometimes when you get down to the grind of your job, it's easy to forget that there's real people out there that are impacted by what you're doing, and real communities that have a stake in the future, and giving them a voice, giving them respect, and giving them the privileges that many other communities have taken for granted for so long is very critical. Unless there's any more questions, I'm gonna thank you again, Wayn. This is fantastic. Thank you to Pride for helping out to get this sorted out, and also Gordon Smith. I see you on there.
Hey, Gordon.
Gordon hooked us up. Was the go-between between the planners and Wayn at African Nova Scotian Affairs. So once again, thank you so much, Wayn, and we'll keep in touch, and we'll let you know how our journey goes, and invite you along to some of these chats just to listen, maybe, if you're interested. So
Yeah, and I will send you a small reading or resource list that I think would be useful to use as a backdrop.
fantastic. Thank you so much. So take care, folks. We're going to let Wayn go, and thank you again. Good to chat, Wayn.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Operate well.